always so nice when people get up and leave when I come up. Good morning.
Good morning.
I want to paint a picture for you. I want you to visualize the words that I'm going to speak. The men were straining at the oars, battling the raging sea. Sweat and water mixed on their brows as they fought, the wind howling and the waves crashing over the sides of the boat. They were exhausted. It had been hours since they set out across the sea. The wind had started after they had traveled some distance from shore, becoming a raging squall in no time. The wind stirred the sea into a frenzy, waves hitting the boat like small battering rams. No matter how hard they rowed, they couldn't make it to shore. They had hardly made any progress since the wind had begun. They were stuck. The disciples had just been sent across the sea by Jesus, and they had been fighting this storm for hours. It was likely the sun was just beginning to come up, and they hadn't been able to make any progress across. They had to be exhausted and weak. Maybe they were ready to just give up and stop rowing and let the wind and the waves take them wherever they were going to go. Have you ever had the feeling of being stuck? Have you ever been physically stuck? In a ditch, or in your car, or wherever. It can be frustrating. Sometimes it's scary, right? What about stuck in life? Or stuck in your sin? No matter what you do, no matter how hard you fight, you don't seem to make any progress. Life doesn't seem to be getting any better or any easier. That pain isn't going away. That heartache won't stop. Or that sin keeps coming back. Or maybe you're just not growing in your faith. These things happen to everyone. Now back to the disciples. Through the wind and the spray, one man thought he saw a shape out on the water. He quickly called attention to it as it seemed to grow bigger. The men all squinted to see through the spray, through the wind and the waves. What was it? It was too small to be a boat. Any boat that size would have quickly been destroyed and its occupants lost. It almost looked like a person, but that was impossible. And yet, there he was. It was a person. They were in the middle of the sea, far from shore. The water was deep here. There were no sandbars or reefs that a person could walk out on. It was impossible. And yet, there he was. No human could get out here, seemingly walking across the waves. There was only one possibility. It was a spirit. The men began to panic. They'd all heard the stories growing up, that evil spirits lived in the sea, or that those who had drowned haunted the waters. Suddenly those stories seemed so real, and they were all believers now. They were doomed. There was no escape. They were going to die. Has anyone ever felt fear? If you say no, I'd like to talk to you and figure out how that's even possible. Have you ever felt panic?
Yeah.
I remember the first time I had a panic attack, I thought I was dying.
Yeah.
It was scary. It just doesn't seem to end. It's like you're not going to ever get out of it. Fear and panic, after the fact, we usually find to be pretty irrational, right? We might get so caught up in the moment, in what is scaring us or how hard it is, that it seems to be everything there is, and we can't see our way through it, and then we start to panic. That uncontrollable fear or anxiety that often causes wildly unthinking behavior. Sometimes in life, we might get stuck in a storm. We can't seem to move forward. We're exhausted and we're weak, and we don't think we can take much more. And then, it seems to get even worse. And we fear we'll never make it. And we stop thinking clearly. We start to panic. We start to believe things that we normally wouldn't. I'm all alone. There's no way out of this. I failed. God has abandoned me. Or worse, God is out to get me. God won't forgive me this time. I'm not good enough. I mean, the apostles actually believed there was a ghost walking across the sea to them. Fear does strange things to our mind when we get stuck. The apostles likely thought they were going to die. And just when their situation seemed as bad as it could get, as hopeless as it could get, there. Do you hear that? Cutting through the howl of the wind and the crashing of the waves comes a voice clear as day. Have courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. Was that Jesus? How was that even possible? Not even he could walk on water, could he? It had to be a trick. Suddenly, one of the men, Peter, speaks, and he shouts to be heard over the wind. Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water. What is Peter doing? And then comes the quiet but clear reply. Come. When you're in the middle of a storm, when you're stuck, what do you do? Do you feel alone? Do you get scared? There's no shame in that. When you can't seem to overcome that sin, do you just give up? Do you feel abandoned in your sin and just let it overtake you? Do you let the guilt consume you? Or when you're stuck in life, when it seems like the struggle is all there is, do you give in to the exhaustion? Do you let fear take over, fear that you'll never make it through? When that pain keeps pounding at you, that heartache doesn't give up. When it hits you like crashing waves, do you give up? Do you stop fighting and just go numb? Do you let the pain and fear that it will never end overwhelm you? Do you sit in the boat, stuck, too afraid to do anything? Do you stay in the boat, or do you stand up and step out? Instead of allowing heartache to make you withdraw, staying at home depressed and overwhelmed, afraid of more pain, do you step out and start moving towards Jesus? Do you force yourself to go out and fellowship with your brothers and sisters? Do you force yourself to engage with people, to let them in? Do you force yourself to reach out to Jesus and pray authentically? Instead of allowing shame and guilt for your sin paralyze you, making you feel worthless and unlovable, do you step out and move towards Jesus? Do you confess your sin to God and to a brother or sister, not fearing judgment? Do you approach God despite feeling unworthy and your mind telling you that you can't go to Him? Instead of struggling with life alone and in silence, do you step out and move toward Jesus? Do you admit to someone that you're struggling? Do you admit to God that you're struggling? And then do you accept the help that Jesus brings into your life? The people He brings, maybe the medicine that He brings, maybe the counseling or even financial aid that He brings. Do you accept it? Do you ignore all your instincts that tell you that as bad as it is, you should just stay where you are? Because it could be worse. Do you take a risk? Do you let yourself be vulnerable in your pain? When the boat is stuck, do you get out and walk through the storm to Jesus, even if it looks scarier, riskier? I'll let you in on a secret. It's not. It's actually safer. Now imagine with me, if you will, the other men watching in shock as Peter actually starts to climb out of the boat. What is he doing? Surely he will drown. Their shock turns to awe as Peter steps out, and he just stands there. He isn't sinking. He is actually standing on the water. And they watch as Peter begins to walk towards the figure, the one that they're now certain is Jesus. Waves taller than Peter continuing to crash around him. Wind that could knock a man over continuing to howl. They watch as Peter continues walking as though on dry land. But then they see Peter's head start to turn from side to side as he gazes in wonder at what's going on around him. Suddenly he seems to falter. His steps start to become hesitant. He looks back towards the boat, and all you see is a face full of panic. Suddenly he begins to sink. The water's up to his knees now. He cries out, "Lord, save me!" And suddenly, Jesus is there, at his side, the water up to Peter's waist now. He reaches down and grasps Peter's hand, pulling him up out of the water. And as the two men stand there, the sea raging around them, you hear Jesus' voice carrying across the wind as he speaks to Peter. "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" You see Peter look down in shame, unable to meet his Lord's gaze as they walk back to the boat together. As soon as they climb in, the howling ceases, the wind is gone, and everyone, including Peter, just stares in a mixture of awe and fear at the man before them. Suddenly they all fall down as if struck and begin to worship him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." I don't know about you, but I often give Peter a lot of flack for doubting. But have you ever thought about the fact that he was the only one who actually had enough faith to get out of the boat? Amen. He trusted Jesus enough to step out of the boat, to step out of his situation that he was stuck in, and move towards Jesus. I mean, sure, the boat's stuck, it's not really going anywhere. But at least he knows boats. He's a fisherman. He knows how to sail them. He knows how to stay afloat in a storm. He does not know how to walk on water. Would any of us trust Jesus that much? Do any of us trust Jesus that much? Honestly, it's easy to understand why Peter doubted. Those waves must have seemed huge next to him. He must have felt so vulnerable standing out there, away from the boat. He took his eyes off of Jesus, and suddenly all he could see was the storm. And he started to doubt that he could make it, that Jesus could get him through. And he begins to sink. Sometimes the way through the storm, relying on Jesus, is harder than staying in the boat where we might feel safe, even though we're stuck. Sometimes it means making yourself vulnerable. Maybe you have stepped out and made your sins known to someone, but then it seems to come back, and you lose hope that you can overcome it. Or maybe you forced yourself to engage with someone and keep moving forward, to not close off because of the heartache you have. But then something happens, and you're reminded of your pain and loss, and suddenly you're back in the middle of it, and it all seems bigger. Or maybe you've admitted that you're struggling with something in life, and you need help, and just when things seem to be getting better, something happens, and it all seems so much worse, and you can't see your way through. Maybe you've realized that your faith isn't growing and progressing, and you're stuck. And you've stepped out of that boat and made yourself vulnerable, committing to growing in your faith. And then life happens, and suddenly it all seems too hard. All you see is the storm and feel how vulnerable you are. And you lose sight of Jesus and start to sink into heartache and pain and despair. You might lose sight of Jesus and start to sink. But hear me when I say, Jesus will always be there to grab your hand and pull you back up. You just need to refocus your eyes on Him and not the storm raging around you. Life can be hard. I think we all know that. Sometimes it can feel like we are in a storm, fighting to move ahead and failing. Life can exhaust us, and it can batter us, and it can be scary when all we see is the storm. Life can make us feel alone. But Jesus can always get to you. Nothing can keep Him away. I mean, He literally walked on water in the middle of a storm to reach His disciples. There's nothing that's going to keep Him from getting through your storm to you. Sometimes Jesus does not arrive in the way we expect. That can be scary. It can be uncomfortable. It could downright terrify us like it did the disciples. But it's important to focus on the fact that He shows up. Sometimes we are called to step out of the boat. Sometimes it's the only way forward, is to step out of the place where we feel safe, even if we're stuck, out of our own understanding, out of our walls, out of our fortress of solitude. Sometimes the only way forward is to make yourselves vulnerable and completely reliant on Jesus. And that too can be scary. And sometimes being out in the open like that and vulnerable, the storm seems to get bigger and we lose focus. It happens to everyone. When you start to lose focus and fall, when you start to sink, remember that if you cry out to Jesus, He will lift you up. The storm may not get better, but He will keep you afloat through it and get you to the other shore. He will always be there when you cry out. He will always offer His hand to you. And when He does, though the storm might rage around you, and you might be out there in the middle of the sea exposed, there will be calm, knowing that you rest safe in the hands of Jesus. He calms the storms, like being in the eye of a hurricane. So, what are you battling today? Do you have the courage to speak up to someone? To call on Jesus and trust that He will show up? Or will you stay crippled by fear and let yourself be tossed around? If you're stuck, if you're struggling, if you're fighting against the wind and the waves and you're getting scared, I want you to stop and I want you to hear Jesus say those words to you. Have courage. It is I. Don't be afraid.
Amen.
And hear Jesus call to you. Hear Him say, come. Come into His embrace. Come to Him wherever you are. He offers courage and strength. He offers you His hand. All you have to do is step out in faith and take it. And you might stumble along the way. Things might seem harder at times. But Jesus has your hand and He will always lift you back up. So, are you struggling? Do you have the courage to admit that and step out in faith? Or are you going to stay stuck in your situation, sitting afraid in the boat? I choose to step out. God knows I have my struggles. For years I have struggled with addiction to porn. You know that. I've admitted that before. And it is scary to admit that to my brothers and sisters. But I know that when I admit that, when I step out, Jesus is there waiting for me, and my brothers and sisters are there. And suddenly I can walk through the storm to freedom. No matter how scary it is, I encourage you to step out and walk towards Jesus.
Amen.